It's been tougher than I expected. It's been better than I expected, but it's still not good enough. Better than I expected because, in fact, Germany has been the real surprise here. It's really stepped up. It's extraordinary. The new German chancellor, who comes from a left-wing party and who's spent nearly 30 years, that party, basically being an almost pacifist party, has committed an extra 100 billion to defence, which is more than twice the size of the UK defence budget, and has said it's going to be spending more than 2% on defence. That's a huge change. And of course, the sanctions from Europe have been strong, and Biden has been surprisingly good, and Boris Johnson has made the right call, which is to back Ukraine and not compromise with Putin. But it's not enough because we need oil and gas sanctions.
And I think you've suggested that there should be a complete ban on Russian oil and gas exports. Is that right?
Exactly. At the moment, the one thing that Putin is betting on is that Britain, and in particular Germany and Italy, are going to continue to import Russian oil and gas. And that is really the thing that keeps this whole economy going. And his economy is in trouble. I mean, a lot of the measures that have been taken on SWIFT, on central banking, I think you might have seen those images, the fact that people can't even use their Apple Pay in the subway now on the metro in Moscow. All of that's having an impact. But the one thing that he believes nobody will ever do is stop taking his oil and gas, because that is worth, literally in a single day, he can get 300 million euro from that.
So how realistic is it to cut that off? You know, what would that look like here in the UK if we were to do that as part of an international effort, obviously?
Well, firstly, there would be an effect on energy prices, but more dramatically, there would be a big effect on the Italian and German economies, which would spill over to the British economy and indeed the global economy. But it's nothing compared to the cost of a European war. I mean, these big wars and having somebody like Putin raging around with tactical nuclear weapons available to him is unimaginable. And wars are very, very costly. The British economy lost nearly half its value during the Second World War. So yes, we would have to pay a bit more money for energy. And governments like Italy and Germany would have to go into debt in order to cover the cost of supporting their energy. But it's definitely worth it. And it's the one thing that Putin is not expecting us to do.
Now, you mentioned about tactical nuclear weapons. You will have heard President Putin's alarmist language several days ago. Is that something you took seriously? Do you think that it is remotely realistic that he could push that button?
It's definitely possible. Russia, unlike countries like Britain, exercise and plan on the basis of using tactical nuclear weapons in a more conventional war. It's part of their armory, and they move them around when they move their troops around. Now, they haven't yet deployed them, and I think the thing that hopefully will stop him deploying them is just the sense that Ukraine is so close to Russia, so intimate with Russia. I mean, these analogies are terrible, and we shouldn't draw these kind of parallels, but it is like, almost feels, and this is one of the reasons Putin's invading, it feels to him close to Scotland, feels to England. Many, many Russians have relatives, many, many more have friends in Ukraine. And the idea of using tactical nuclear weapons on your closest neighbours, I think, hopefully will be something that will give even Putin pause for thought.
And what would that look like if he did take that very drastic step? Would that be a weapon that affected tens of thousands of people? Would the effects of that spill over into other countries? No, I mean, it depends what he's doing. But some of these tactical nuclear weapons are called tactical because they have very limited impact and range. So it's not like dropping an atom bomb on Hiroshima. These are genuinely things that are designed to be used on the battlefield. The problem is the precedent that it causes, because of course nobody has used these things in war since the Second World War. And nobody, fortunately, at the moment is talking about the use of chemical weapons, as we know has happened in Syria. Do you think that President Putin, frustrated by lack of progress, he's been ritually humiliated, might resort to that? I think the key thing with Putin is to understand that we are not predicting him well. We don't understand him well. So anything that I say about him is speculation.
He's a very different guy to the guy that was around 15 years ago. It's remarkable how much has changed. He seems much more lonely, much more isolated. He's probably making decisions which the Russian general staff do not approve of, and he's worrying them. But if you force me to guess, I would say that it's unlikely that he will do things like that. I think it's very unlikely that he will actually use tactical nuclear weapons. I think it's very unlikely he'll use chemical weapons. I think what is more likely to happen is that we will go into a phase of much heavier conflict. He'd hoped to be able to get through Ukraine quite quickly without killing many people. He'd hoped that he'd be able to topple Zelensky's government rapidly, and he was really relying on what he'd called hybrid warfare, which is cyber attacks, special forces, small light movements, which he thought could topple the country. Now that's failed. Now he's basically bogged down. The only option really remaining to him, or the next option to remain to him, is to grind his way through those cities in street-to-street combat, and that is brutal, really brutal.
How much of a grasp do you think the UK Prime Minister, our Prime Minister Boris Johnson, has on these events? Does he understand either the big picture or even the granular?
It's difficult to know. I was a Minister of State in the Foreign Office when he was the Foreign Secretary, and certainly in those days, he didn't do detail. That wasn't his thing. And it was quite frustrating. I'd go into meetings and he'd say to me, Rory, we've got to sort out Libya. Libya is a bite-sized British problem. And I'd go in and say, but Foreign Secretary, we don't actually have an ambassador in Libya at the moment. The ambassador's in Tunisia, and this is what the budget would be, and this and the other, and he'd lose interest. I think in this case, though, he's got the main point, which is that he has clearly come out and said Putin is an aggressive bully. He's clearly identified that Zelensky in this conflict is the good guy, in simple terms. And
sounds pretty basic at this point.
And that we shouldn't be appeasing somebody who's invading another person's country. So I think he's got the right judgment. I think it's extremely unlikely that he's going to be following the in and out details of what's happening on the front lines or has particular views on that stuff.
And what about the Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss? You've said that she doesn't really or never used to have any interest in foreign affairs. Do you think she's on top of this?
So Liz Truss is bright, hardworking, and will be getting into this stuff and taking clear lines. It's definitely true. When I began in politics, this was not her bag at all. And I remember very, very clearly when I was getting on the Foreign Affairs Committee and running to be chairman of the Defence Committee, that she wanted to stay as far away from that stuff as she possibly could. Her real interest in those days was education. But there's no doubt she's a bright, determined figure with firm views.
And looking at bigger picture, what about the state of the Foreign Office here? How well equipped is it to manage a crisis like this? Obviously, we've got the MOD suffered huge cuts. Nonetheless, Ben Wallace seems to be providing very strong leadership, many would say. What about the Foreign Office? Is it so depleted that it can't really cope with a crisis like this?
Well, I think it's very depressing what's happened right across British defence and foreign policy. You're right, Ben Wallace has done a good job, and he seems to be really coming into his own. But the truth of the matter is that we have eviscerated our military and our foreign service, not just over the last 10 years, but over the last 30 years. So all the capacity that we really had militarily to deal with land war in Europe has been run down. Tanks have been got rid of, things like heavy bridging capacity has been abolished, and people got obsessed since the time of David Cameron with the idea that everything was about a tilt towards Asia and China. Huge investment went into completely unnecessary aircraft carriers, fantasies about the British Navy, and we totally took our eye off the ball of conventional land warfare. So that's one big problem. The second problem, as you say, is the Foreign Office itself. It's very sadly, no government seems to be prepared to say that we need a decent Foreign Office and that we need to spend money on it, because the story in the Daily Mail is always ambassadors quaffing champagne and residences. Nobody wants to increase their budget. But the truth is the French spend nearly twice as much on their foreign service as we do. And if we're serious about global Britain, we need diplomats who speak other people's language as well, who spend a long time there and have people on the ground.
So we're a bit tight on time, but I wanted to ask you to what extent you think what's happening now is our own fault due to a lack of strategic vision and weakness over the past decade?
I think it's certainly the fault of the West cumulatively. So it's the fault of the United States, the United Kingdom, Europe, in our very, very bad response to Crimea, our very, very weak and uncertain response around red lines on Syria, and the catastrophic withdrawal from Afghanistan, all of which convinced Putin that the West was in decline. He talks about this a lot very openly, that he wasn't going to face any opposition and that he had an opportunity to do something quite as horrific as invade another country in this way for the first time since the Second World War. And that shows nearly 15 years of pusillanimity and weakness and lack of conviction from the West.
And do you see any hope, and this is a really big picture question, do you see any hope for Britain's declining place in the world? Some would say that actually the UK has stepped up in a relatively impressive way over this crisis. Do you think that marks any kind of hope of a revival of us actually punching above our weight?
I agree with you that Boris Johnson and Liz Truss have made the fundamental right call on Ukraine and Russia, and they did it quickly and they did it clearly. But to really rebuild our international position, we have to invest in institutions and people. It's not about one or two politicians making a speech. It's about having a good military, a good foreign service, a strong intelligence service. And we've run all those things terribly, terribly down, partly because politicians are not interested in talking about civil service reform, partly because the public doesn't want to spend more money on those kinds of things. But if Britain really wants to do those things, I sometimes wonder whether Britain does. I sometimes wonder whether actually Britain pretends that it cares about global Britain, likes waving the flag and going, yeah, but doesn't actually want to spend any money on it and doesn't really want to think about the difficult questions and compromises and diplomacy that's involved in really exercising influence in the world. But if we did want to do it, we certainly could. We are, as we keep saying, the fifth largest economy in the world. But the truth is that the French, who have a smaller economy than us, have a much, much more impressive international machine.
I mean, for example, I remember you telling me years ago that there weren't enough people who spoke the relevant languages during the conflict in Afghanistan within the Foreign Office and the Department for International Affairs. Do we have enough Russian speakers, for example, in the Foreign Office?
No, I mean, the whole thing is pathetic. I mean, when Putin invaded Crimea in 2014, it turned out we didn't have a Crimea desk officer in the Defense Intelligence Department. We were scrabbling to move people across from other parts of Central Asia. I mean, we simply haven't got the coverage and the political intelligence. It's actually difficult for us to perform our role as a permanent member of the UN Security Council because we're talking, for example, all the time about Africa and countries where we don't have embassies, where we don't really have any information. We're bluffing. The British are in the position of bluffing. And I know we have a prime minister who bluffs, but we don't need a whole system who bluffs.
Okay, Rory Stewart, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.